Truckee Lake, November 1846. While 87 emigrants scrambled to build quick cabins before winter hit, one Irish farmer named Patrick Breen was doing something his neighbors called heartless. He was rationing food that wasn't even scarce yet. He counted every pound of beef, measured portions like a miser, and refused to share when families came asking. They called him stingy. They called him cruel. Most frontier men believed you worked harder when times got tough. Hunt more, chop more wood, keep trying until something broke your way. Breen believed the opposite. He treated calories like coins in a bank and refused to spend them on hope. Then the snow came. Not 3 feet, not 5 feet, 20 feet of snow that buried cabins completely and turned the Sierra Nevada into a frozen tomb. No rescue could reach them until February. No hunting was possible. Wood became so hard to fetch that men burned calories just staying alive. Standard frontier methods failed. 42 people died. But that heartless farmer? He walked out in spring with his wife and all 7 children, 9 people alive when neighbors who'd called him selfish lay frozen in their beds. What did Patrick Breen understand about survival math that everyone else missed? And how did his cruel discipline become the difference between a family that lived and 40 families that didn't? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wagons had been climbing for days when the Sierra Nevada finally defeated them. October 31st, 1846, just miles from the summit of Truckee Pass, close enough that men could see California stretching beyond the peaks, yet the early snow made the final ascent impossible. Oxen stumbled in drifts that reached their bellies. Wagon wheels spun uselessly against ice-slicked granite. After hours of futile struggle, the inevitable decision came: retreat to the lake below and wait for conditions to improve. Patrick Breen watched the other families make camp with the practiced eye of a man who had already accepted what most refused to believe. This wasn't a delay, it was a siege. While his neighbors threw together quick shelters and talked optimistically about trying the pass again in a week or two, Breen began keeping a diary. November 20th, 1846. His first entry, a careful accounting of their situation that read more like a ledger than a journal. He wrote because he understood they were no longer travelers. They were inventory managers in a contest against time. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 87 people scattered across several crude cabins around the lake. Cattle scattered in the early storms, some already lost to wolves or wandering. The nearest settlement in California lay beyond a mountain pass that winter had just declared impassable. Breen counted mouths in his own shelter. Himself, his wife Margaret, and 7 children ranging from infant to teenager. 9 people who would need calories every day until rescue arrived or spring opened the trails. Most emigrant families approached frontier hardship the way they approached frontier opportunity, with optimism, hard work, and the assumption that effort would eventually break the problem. When game grew scarce, you hunted longer. When wood ran low, you ranged farther to cut more. When the weather turned bad, you pushed through it with determination and grit. This philosophy had carried thousands of families across the continent successfully. It was the backbone of westward expansion, the practical wisdom that turned wilderness into homesteads. Patrick Breen had watched this philosophy work on Iowa farmland, where bad weather lasted days or weeks, not months. But at Truckee Lake, surrounded by peaks that climbed toward 9,000 feet, he made a calculation that put him at odds with every survival instinct his neighbors trusted. Instead of working harder, he would work less. Instead of spending calories to solve problems, he would hoard them like a banker protecting gold. The first hard choice came in early November when it became clear that the missing cattle wouldn't be found before winter deepened. Other families talked about organized searches, systematic hunting, ambitious woodcutting projects to prepare for a siege that might last until Christmas. Breen looked at his remaining beef, poor quality meat without bread or salt, as he noted in his diary, and began treating it like a finite resource that had to stretch across an unknowable timeline. He established portions. He set rules. He refused his children's requests for larger servings even when the meat was still relatively plentiful. The neighbors noticed immediately. In a camp where families shared labor and often shared meals, Breen's strict rationing looked like miserliness. When children from other cabins came around hungry, Margaret Breen turned them away politely but firmly. When adults suggested pooling resources or organizing communal cooking to stretch supplies, the Breens participated minimally. Patrick's response to suggestions about borrowing or lending food was always the same calculation: 9 mouths, uncertain timeline, finite supplies. The mockery started quietly, the way it always did in close-knit frontier communities. Whispered observations about the Irish farmer who acted like he didn't trust his own neighbors, comments about a man who hoarded food while children went hungry, speculation about what Patrick Breen thought he knew that everyone else didn't. The criticism carried moral weight because generosity and mutual aid were survival tools on the frontier. Families helped families, communities shared burdens. A man who refused to help his neighbors in crisis was violating the social contract that made frontier life possible. But Breen's method wasn't selfishness, it was mathematics. He had developed what would later be recognized as systematic resource management under siege conditions, though no one around Truckee Lake had a name for it in 1846. His system started with inventory, count everything edible down to scraps and bones. Next came timeline estimation, assume the worst-case scenario for how long supplies had to last. Then came rationing, divide total calories by total days to establish a baseline survival ration. Finally came discipline. Protect the ration against all pressure, whether from hungry children, desperate neighbors, or his own impulses to provide comfort through food. The snow kept falling. By late November, drifts reached 3 feet around the cabins. By December 1st, Breen recorded depths of 5.5 to 6 feet, with the storm showing no sign of breaking. Movement between shelters became difficult. Wood gathering, already a daily necessity, turned into a major expedition that burned significant calories just to maintain heat. The casual optimism of early November, "We'll try the pass again when this storm breaks," faded into the grim recognition that they were trapped until spring. Other families began to understand what Breen had calculated weeks earlier, but their belated recognition came with a price. Supplies that might have lasted months under strict rationing had been consumed at normal rates during the weeks when escape still seemed possible. Cattle slaughtered for convenience rather than necessity. Calories spent on ambitious projects that accomplished little. Energy wasted on futile attempts to locate missing stock or clear impassable trails. As December deepened and the snow climbed toward the rooflines of their crude shelters, Patrick Breen's unpopular system began to look less like stinginess and more like foresight. His family remained healthy, while others weakened. His children complained about hunger but showed none of the devastating weight loss that marked families who had spent their reserves early. His diary entries maintained their careful, methodical tone, while other men grew desperate and erratic. The camp's first deaths came in December, not from starvation yet, but from the cascade of problems that followed when people spent calories faster than they could be replaced. Weakness that made wood gathering dangerous. Poor judgment that led to exposure injuries. Desperation that drove men to attempt impossible journeys through snow that had already proven deadly. Each death reinforced the same lesson that Patrick Breen had grasped in November. When you cannot add food, your only power lies in controlling how fast you spend what remains. The snow transformed every simple task into a tax on survival. What had been a 10-minute walk to gather firewood in October now required an hour of exhausting labor through drifts that swallowed men to their waists. Patrick Breen recorded the mathematics of their new reality with characteristic precision. Moving through deep snow multiplied every calorie expenditure while offering no increase in calorie intake. Wood, the most basic necessity for staying alive, had become expensive in terms of energy spent versus energy preserved. By early December, the lake camp had developed an informal economy based on effort sharing. Families took turns breaking trail to the scattered deadfall that served as their fuel supply. Men worked in groups, rotating the exhausting job of leading through unmarked snow. The system made sense from a community standpoint: shared labor, shared risk, shared benefit, but it violated every principle of Patrick Breen's survival mathematics. Group expeditions meant conforming to other men's pace and priorities. Shared trails meant walking routes chosen for convenience rather than efficiency. Communal woodcutting meant spending calories on projects that served the camp's needs rather than his family's specific requirements. Breen opted out quietly. He mapped the closest sources of dead wood to his cabin and established the shortest possible routes to reach them. He cut wood in small, measured quantities that matched his family's daily consumption rather than stockpiling for uncertain future needs. Most importantly, he refused to participate in the ambitious group projects that other families saw as necessary preparations for a long siege. While neighbors organized major expeditions to locate and drag back large logs, Breen made quick, efficient trips for smaller fuel that could be processed without wasting energy on transport. The social friction began immediately. In a camp where survival depended on cooperation, Breen's selective participation looked like freeloading. When other families exhausted themselves breaking trail to distant wood sources, the Breens benefited from the paths without contributing equal labor. When communal work parties returned with timber that would serve multiple families, Patrick Breen was notably absent from the crews. His neighbors interpreted his behavior through the lens of frontier social contracts. A man who took from the community without giving back was stealing from families that included hungry children. The missing stock became the camp's great false hope through November and into December. Cattle had scattered during the early storms, and most families maintained the optimistic belief that organized search parties would eventually locate the animals. Men spent precious calories on systematic hunts through snow-covered terrain, following tracks that led nowhere, and investigating distant movements that turned out to be shadows or wind-blown debris. The searches offered psychological comfort, the feeling of taking action rather than simply waiting for disaster, but they operated on borrowed time and borrowed energy. Breen understood that the missing cattle represented a gambler's fallacy applied to survival. Every day spent searching was a day's worth of calories invested in an outcome that became less likely as winter deepened. Every expedition that returned empty-handed was proof that energy had been converted into nothing useful. He noted the futility in his diary with characteristic understatement, recording the camp's continued hope while privately calculating how much food could have been saved if men had accepted their losses in November rather than chasing them through December. The first major test of Breen's system came when a group of 17 people attempted to escape on improvised snowshoes in mid-December. The party included some of the strongest men in the camp, people who had ridiculed Breen's conservative approach as defeatist. Their plan embodied everything that frontier wisdom recommended: bold action, determined effort, and refusal to accept defeat. They would push through to California, establish contact with rescue parties, and return with supplies before the weaker members of the camp faced starvation. The snowshoe party's failure demonstrated the deadly mathematics that Breen had recognized weeks earlier. Deep snow didn't just make travel difficult, it made travel impossible for people who lacked the caloric reserves to sustain the enormous energy expenditure required. The 17 who attempted escape had already weakened themselves through November and December by following conventional frontier logic, working harder when conditions got worse. They left the lake camp without the fat reserves and muscle mass needed to survive a week-long journey through mountain wilderness in winter conditions. Only 7 members of the snowshoe party survived to reach California, and their survival came at a cost that validated every aspect of Breen's conservative strategy. The dead included men who had been among the strongest and most capable members of the original immigrant company. Their deaths weren't random misfortune, they were the predictable result of spending calories faster than circumstances allowed. The failure sent a message back to the lake camp that was both practical and psychological. There would be no escape through individual effort, no matter how determined. As word filtered back about the snowshoe party's losses, the camp's attitude toward Patrick Breen's methods began shifting from mockery toward grudging recognition. His refusal to participate in hopeless search expeditions looked less like cowardice and more like foresight. His strict rationing appeared less selfish and more mathematically sound. But recognition came with its own problems, because desperate families began to assume that Breen's conservative approach meant he had food reserves that could be shared or borrowed. The borrowing requests started in late December and intensified through January. Neighbors who had criticized Breen's stinginess now approached him as a potential source of aid. The requests carried moral weight because they came from families with children, and they implied that Breen's household was somehow better supplied than others facing the same crisis. But the assumptions were wrong. Breen's family wasn't surviving because they had more food, they were surviving because they had spent less energy. Their advantage wasn't secret stockpiles, but systematic discipline applied earlier and maintained longer than their neighbors could sustain. Each request for borrowing forced Breen into an impossible social position. Refusing help to hungry children violated every norm of frontier community behavior. But lending food that his own family needed for survival violated the mathematical logic that had kept them alive through December. His diary entries from this period record the camp's increasing desperation alongside his own family's continued discipline. He notes neighbors growing weak while maintaining his household's strict rations. He documents requests for aid while carefully tracking his own diminishing supplies. The snow continued climbing past the windows, past the door frames, until the cabins became caves connected to the surface by narrow tunnels. Movement between shelters required following paths that were more like trenches carved through snow that packed harder with each storm. The camp had become completely isolated from the outside world, dependent entirely on the supplies they had managed to preserve through the first 2 months of siege. Those who had spent their reserves early in hope of quick rescue now faced the reality that no help was coming until spring, and spring was still months away. By January 13, 1847, Patrick Breen recorded that snow must be 13 feet deep around the cabins, and still falling. The shelters had disappeared entirely beneath the white mass, transformed into underground chambers connected to the surface world by narrow shafts that had to be constantly cleared to prevent complete burial. The camp's architecture had fundamentally changed. What began as crude log cabins perched beside a mountain lake had become a network of caves carved from packed snow, where families lived in perpetual twilight, and ventilation was a daily battle against suffocation. The transition from food to materials marked the camp's entry into a new phase of survival that few American immigrants had ever faced. Meat supplies that had seemed adequate in November were exhausted by early January. The remaining cattle, those few animals that hadn't been lost in storms or slaughtered for winter provisions, were now impossible to reach through snowdrifts that buried them completely. Hunting was no longer merely unproductive. It was physically impossible in terrain that made movement a struggle for survival rather than a search for game. Oxhide, which had roofed the wagons during 6 months of overland travel, became the camp's new currency. Rawhide that had been harness and tack, leather that had been shoes and clothing, it entered the grim equation of survival. Patrick Breen wrote the line that defined their new reality. Hides are the only article we depend on. The transformation was both practical and psychological. Materials that had been tools were becoming food, and the boundary between shelter and sustenance was dissolving under the pressure of absolute need. The process of converting hide into edible nutrition required techniques that most immigrants had never learned and hoped never to need. Rawhide had to be scraped clean, cut into manageable pieces, and boiled for hours to render the collagen into a gelatinous broth that provided some caloric content and created the illusion of substantial food. The cooking process consumed precious fuel, wood that had to be gathered through exhausting expeditions into snow-buried forest, but the alternative was starvation. Families spent their days feeding wood into fires to extract minimal nutrition from leather, trading one scarce resource for another in calculations that grew more desperate with each passing week. The social dynamics of hide distribution revealed the camp's transformation into a survival economy where normal rules of property and sharing no longer applied. Families who had shared resources freely during the wagon journey now guarded ox harnesses and leather goods with the intensity of miners protecting gold claims. Arguments broke out over ownership of materials that had been communal property when they served transportation rather than nutrition. Men who had worked together to repair wagons now competed for access to the very materials they had once collaborated to maintain. Some refused the transition entirely. Breen noted families where members won't eat hides, maintaining social taboos even as starvation advanced. These holdouts represented the persistence of civilized sensibilities in circumstances that had moved beyond civilization's boundaries. Their refusal wasn't irrational. Boiled hide provided minimal nutrition and still left people hungry, but it reflected an inability to accept how completely their situation had changed. They were still thinking like emigrants temporarily delayed rather than castaways fighting for survival. Patrick Breen's household made the transition with the same systematic discipline that had guided their rationing since November. Margaret Breen learned to process hide efficiently, maximizing the nutritional extraction while minimizing the wood consumption required for cooking. The family's children accepted hide broth as their primary food source without the resistance that plagued other families. Most importantly, the Breens treated their remaining hide supply with the same careful inventory management that had preserved their meat supplies through December. The borrowing pressure intensified as other families recognized that the Breens had maintained their hide reserves more successfully than households that had consumed materials carelessly during the early months of siege. Neighbors who had criticized Patrick's conservative approach now assumed that his caution meant surplus supplies. The request came with increasing desperation and moral authority, families with starving children asking for aid from a household that appeared better provisioned. But appearances deceived. Breen's family wasn't surviving because they had more resources. They were surviving because they had managed identical resources more carefully. Each lending request forced impossible calculations. A piece of hide that could keep Breen's own children alive for 2 days might save a neighbor's child for 1 day, but at the cost of advancing his own family's starvation timeline. The mathematics were brutal and personal. Sharing meant choosing which children would die first. Breen's refusal to lend wasn't cruelty, but arithmetic. His diary entries from this period record the requests alongside careful tallies of his remaining supplies, noting how thin the margins had become between survival and catastrophe for his own household. The snow reached depths that transformed survival itself into architecture. By mid-January, movement between cabins required following tunnels carved through packed snow that rose higher than the original roof lines. Families lived in chambers lit by oil lamps or firelight, where carbon dioxide buildup from poor ventilation competed with cold as a daily threat. The physical act of maintaining shelter, clearing ventilation shafts, reinforcing snow walls, keeping access tunnels from collapsing, consumed calories that had to be balanced against the nutritional return from processed hide. Weather became irrelevant to daily life because weather existed 15 feet above where people actually lived. Storm or sunshine made no difference to families buried beneath accumulated snow that had achieved its own structural integrity. Time was marked by the slow consumption of hide reserves rather than by calendar dates or natural light. Days blended into nights in chambers where the only reliable light came from fires that consumed wood gathered through expeditions that might cost more energy than the food they made possible to cook. The psychological pressure of living underground while slowly consuming the materials of civilization took its toll on camp morale in ways that pure hunger might not have achieved. People were not merely starving, they were eating their own tools, consuming the leather goods and hide materials that had carried them across the continent. Each meal represented another step away from the possibility of resuming normal life, even if rescue arrived. Wagons without harnesses, animals without tack, families without shoes, the camp was cannibalizing its own capacity for future travel in order to survive until future travel became possible. Patrick Breen continued his diary through January with entries that read like ledger books rather than personal journals. He noted the depths of snow, the condition of remaining supplies, and the steady weakening of neighbors with the same methodical precision that had characterized his early entries. His household maintained its discipline, while others fractured under pressure that was both physical and moral. The man who had been mocked for his stinginess in November had become a case study in survival mathematics by January. The recognition came too late for families that had already spent their reserves on hope rather than rationing them against reality. February brought the hunger that moved beyond discomfort into the realm where survival became a daily negotiation with death. Patrick Breen's diary entries from early February reflected a household that had reached the mathematical endpoint of even the most careful rationing. But a little meat left and only part of 3 hides, he wrote on February 5th, the careful inventory of a man who had spent 3 months treating calories like currency and now faced bankruptcy, despite every precaution. The psychological pressure reached Margaret Breen in ways that months of careful discipline hadn't prepared her to handle. Patrick noted that his wife had become uneasy about their prospects for survival, a significant observation from a woman who had supported the family's strict rationing through the darkest months of winter. Her fear wasn't irrational panic, but mathematical recognition. The supplies that systematic management had stretched from November through January were finally approaching zero, and no amount of discipline could extend them much further. The social dynamics of the camp had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the mutual aid communities that typically sustained frontier life. Families that had shared labor and resources during the wagon journey now viewed each other through the lens of survival competition. Every household guarded its remaining supplies against neighbors who might take by force what they couldn't obtain through requests. The camp had fractured into isolated units where trust had been replaced by careful calculation of who might survive and who represented a threat to survival. The borrowing pressure that had tested Patrick Breen's resolve in January intensified through February with requests that carried different moral weight. Neighbors no longer asked for temporary loans with implied promises of repayment. They asked for charity that acknowledged their own approaching deaths. Parents requested food for children who were visibly starving. Adults offered to trade future services for immediate sustenance, bargains that assumed survival long enough to fulfill such obligations. The requests forced Breen into the role of judge, deciding which appeals for aid were genuine necessity versus attempts to transfer the burden of death from one family to another. Breen's response to these desperate appeals revealed the full implications of survival mathematics applied without sentiment. His diary records neighbors who believed he had meat to spare, a perception based on his family's continued relative health rather than actual surplus supplies. The assumption reflected a common misconception about resource management during crisis, that families who maintained discipline necessarily possessed secret reserves. But Breen's advantage wasn't hidden food. It was systematic spending of identical resources that other families had consumed more quickly through November and December. February 23rd brought the decision that marked the camp's complete transition from civilization to survival necessity. Patrick Breen shot and dressed Towser, the family dog that had traveled with them from Iowa and survived the mountain crossing that had defeated so many humans. The entry in his diary was characteristically matter-of-fact, noting the acquisition of fresh meat without commentary on the emotional cost of consuming an animal that had been companion rather than livestock. The decision represented pure survival arithmetic. Protein was protein, regardless of its source or the emotional attachments that civilized life demanded. The consumption of Towser provided the Breen family with nutrition that other households lacked, but it also marked their entry into the psychological territory that the camp had been approaching since January. They were no longer immigrants delayed by weather. They were castaways consuming whatever materials could sustain life. The dog represented food that hadn't been processed through the hide-boiling techniques that provided minimal nutrition, actual meat that could restore strength rather than merely postponing starvation. Talk of eating human remains had begun circulating through the camp by late February, whispered conversations about boundaries that desperate families might cross if conditions continued deteriorating. Breen recorded these discussions in his diary with the same careful neutrality he applied to weather. Observations, noting the camp's psychological state without expressing judgment about decisions that other families might make. The conversations reflected the complete breakdown of social constraints that had governed behavior during 6 months of overland travel. The arrival of the first relief party on February 18th represented salvation that came almost too late for systematic mathematics to matter. Daniel Rhodes and the men who struggled through mountain snow to reach the lake camp found a community that had been reduced to its essential elements, some families barely alive, others already dead, and the few households like the Breens that had managed to extend survival through discipline that most emigrants couldn't have sustained. The rescuers brought provisions, but they also brought external validation of the survival methods that had sustained some families while others perished. Rhodes and his companions could observe directly which approaches had succeeded and which had failed. The Breen cabin, containing 9 people who could still walk and think clearly, stood in stark contrast to shelters where families had succumbed to starvation despite facing identical conditions and having access to identical resources at the beginning of the siege. The rescue logistics revealed the final mathematics of winter survival in the Sierra Nevada. Relief parties could carry limited supplies over mountain terrain that made every pound of food a calculated burden. Priority went to people who were strong enough to travel immediately, creating a brutal triage system where the weakest victims of poor resource management couldn't be saved even after help arrived. Families that had maintained their strength through systematic rationing became the easiest to rescue, while those who had spent their reserves early faced the irony of dying after salvation reached the camp. Patrick Breen's household prepared to leave the lake camp with the methodical organization that had characterized their survival through 4 months of siege. His final diary entries noted the logistics of departure, the condition of families being left behind, and the weather that would affect the rescue journey. The tone remained consistent with entries from November, careful observations recorded without dramatic interpretation, the written record of a man who had approached catastrophe as a problem requiring systematic solution rather than heroic gesture. The contrast between the Breen family's departure and the condition of neighbors who remained behind provided the definitive proof of systematic resource management under siege conditions. 9 people walked out of the mountains because 2 adults had treated survival as an exercise in inventory control rather than frontier optimism. The success wasn't dramatic or inspiring, it was mathematical, achieved through discipline that most families found impossible to sustain when children went hungry and neighbors requested aid. The rescue statistics told the story that frontier sentiment preferred to avoid. Of 87 immigrants who had entered the Sierra Nevada in late October 1846, 42 were dead and 45 survived, but survival wasn't distributed randomly across families or methods. Patrick Breen walked out of the mountains on March 1st, 1847, with his wife, Margaret, and all 7 children, 9 people alive from a household that had entered the siege with 9 people. In a disaster where nearly half the victims died, the Breens achieved a survival rate that stood as stark mathematical proof of systematic resource management versus conventional frontier optimism. The vindication was quiet and practical, lacking the dramatic confrontations or moral speeches that defined most frontier stories. Daniel Rhodes and the relief parties didn't need to hear explanations of rationing theory. They could observe the results directly. Families that had maintained discipline through the winter months were strong enough to travel immediately. Households that had spent their resources early required additional rescue attempts or couldn't be moved at all. The evidence was written in the physical condition of survivors and the location of bodies. A ledger book of survival mathematics that recorded success and failure with unforgiving precision. The Breen method, which had appeared cruel to desperate neighbors in January, now looked like foresight to men who understood survival under extreme conditions. Relief party members noted which families had maintained their strength and which had succumbed to starvation despite having access to identical resources at the beginning of the siege. The pattern wasn't random misfortune, it correlated directly with resource management strategies that could be observed and documented. Other survivors began adopting elements of Breen's systematic approach during the rescue process itself. Families waiting for subsequent relief. Parties implemented strict rationing of the supplies that rescue teams had brought. Men who had criticized conservative resource management in November now insisted on controlled distribution of rescue provisions. The conversion wasn't philosophical but practical. They had observed which methods produced living children and which produced graves marked in snow that would melt to reveal the consequences of poor calculation. The broader implications extended beyond individual survival to questions that would shape American expansion for decades. The Donner Party disaster had resulted from decisions made hundreds of miles before the Sierra Nevada, when emigrants chose an untested cutoff route over established trails that had proven reliable. The tragedy was fundamentally about risk assessment and resource management on a scale that affected entire families rather than individual decisions. Patrick Breen's success within the larger disaster provided a template for survival under siege conditions, but it also highlighted the importance of avoiding such conditions through better planning and route selection. Word of the Breen family's complete survival spread through California settlements, with the kind of detail that frontier communities use to extract practical lessons from disaster. Men who planned overland journeys or faced winter isolation in remote locations wanted to understand the specific techniques that had kept 9 people alive when neighbors with identical resources had starved. The story wasn't inspiring in the traditional sense. It didn't feature heroic rescues or dramatic sacrifice, but it provided actionable information for families who might face similar conditions. The diary that Patrick Breen had kept from November 20th through March 1st became a primary source document that preserved day-by-day evidence of survival under conditions that most Americans would never experience. His entries provided detailed records of snow depths, food, supplies, weather patterns, and social dynamics that turned abstract survival theory into documented case study. The diary's value wasn't literary. Breen wrote like a bookkeeper rather than a storyteller, but it preserved information that could save lives if other families faced similar circumstances. The legacy principle that emerged from the Breen family's survival was elegantly simple. When you cannot add food, your only power lies in controlling how fast you spend what remains. This rule applied to frontier isolation, military sieges, economic disaster, or any situation where resources were finite and resupply was uncertain. The principle required accepting limitations rather than fighting them, choosing systematic discipline over heroic effort, and treating survival as a mathematical problem rather than a test of character or determination. Modern recognition of Patrick Breen's achievement came through historical analysis that separated documented facts from dramatic mythology surrounding the Donner Party disaster. Most popular accounts focused on cannibalism and sensational suffering, but careful examination of primary sources revealed that systematic resource management had been the decisive factor in determining which families survived and which perished. The Breen diary provided objective evidence of methods that worked versus approaches that failed under identical conditions. The survival techniques that kept the Breen family alive became part of practical knowledge that frontier families carried into remote territories where winter isolation was a recurring threat. The system was transferable: inventory everything edible, including materials that could be converted to food. Establish rationing based on worst-case timeline estimates. Minimize energy expenditure on projects that couldn't directly extend survival time. Maintain discipline against social pressure to share resources that your own family needed. Treat survival as inventory management rather than heroic endeavor. California settlements used the Donner Party disaster as a cautionary tale about route selection and winter timing, but they also used Patrick Breen's methods as a template for resource management under siege conditions. Remote mining camps, isolated homesteads, and military posts adopted variations of his systematic approach to surviving periods when resupply was impossible and stored provisions had to sustain life through extended emergencies. The Breen family's story provided American expansion with practical proof that discipline could triumph over circumstances that defeated conventional frontier wisdom. In a culture that celebrated bold action and determined effort, their survival demonstrated the power of careful calculation and systematic restraint. They had won a contest against the Sierra Nevada not through heroic struggle, but through bookkeeping that treated survival as a mathematical problem requiring mathematical solutions. Their success offered future emigrants a choice between romantic frontier optimism and practical survival systems that prioritized results over sentiment.